All right, good to go.
Thank you, Allison. All right. So while we're waiting for more people to join, we'll go ahead and kick this conversation off a little bit. For those who don't know me, I am Larry Whiteside Jr. I'm a career CISO, and I call myself a thought leader. I don't know. But we're here today to talk about a number of things. I'll let my co-host introduce herself. She's far more known than me, but this would be a great conversation today.
Okay. Thank you, Larry. My name is Shamla Naidoo, and I have a retirement portfolio. Just wanted to make sure that everyone knew who I am. I've been a practitioner for 40 some odd years. Out of that, half of it I spent as a practitioner, and then the other half of it as an engineer, and the other half as a cybersecurity leader. So that's what I bring to this conversation. Happy to be here with my buddy, Larry.
Yes. And for 40 years, oh my word. I say 30 and I'm like, good Lord, it seems like forever. Oh, I'm so happy to have this conversation with you.
I'm happy to be here, Larry.
So you want to kick this off, Shamla?
We could do that. Why don't you introduce the topic and then we can see where people want to go with it.
Yeah. So today's topic is really around risk in the board. So as security practitioners, you're probably aware that the board is getting very, very deeply involved with cyber. They recognize the risk to the business, not as much as we think they should, right? So Shamla and I have had many of these conversations, but the board is getting more involved. They are starting to ask questions. They are starting to dive in and try and understand how is cyber impacting or not impacting the business, and starting to really potentially hold CISOs and executives accountable to the cybersecurity strategy. Now, the SEC is definitely a part of the reason that that's becoming a thing. We've had a number of lawsuits over the last couple of years that have come out of the SEC around different breaches that have happened. And all of you have likely gotten at least one notice within the last 2 to 5 years of you being part of some major breach. So with that, and with all of the talk and all of the conversation, we want to get into the dialogue around the board. We want to talk about what is the board asking? What is the board looking for? Why are they looking for it? What are the things they're doing to hold executives accountable? And how can executives be better prepared to really answer the questions of the board and meet the needs of the board to further the cyber program? So with that, let's start. So Shamla, you and I both sit actively on boards. You're on a couple of more than I am, but with your experience and having reported to the boards for a long time, help me understand what's happened over the last 10 years. How have you seen boards mature more? What were they asking you 5 to 10 years ago versus what are they asking you today?
Yeah, Larry, let's just get down to the meat of this conversation, right? Which is the boards are interested in cyber nowadays. But the fact is that forever they've been subject to the rules, especially for public companies. Now, private companies are a whole new different situation. Not-for-profit is a whole different situation. But for publicly held, publicly traded companies, the boards have always been tasked with managing risk, right? And what does that really mean? So if I can just, help to explain, I think that might be helpful to this community. The board has a task, and their single task is to protect the shareholder and to stand in the shoes of the shareholder inside the boardroom, right? Because the general investing public are not in the board meetings. So we, as board members, we represent the shareholder in those discussions. One of the things that's really helpful is, understanding that context, because boards have always talked about risk. They have always try to help to figure out what the shareholders' risk is, and to then talk to the management about, well, what are they doing about the risk, etc. The reason why this conversation is important is cyber hasn't just made its way to the board agenda. Historically, there were many topics that made its way to the board agenda, including technology, cyber, etc. So it was just another topic of risk. Now, I think it's becoming a little bit more focused because the risk has risen. The risk is higher than it has ever been. So when we have conversations in the boardroom, the whole point is to figure out how we make trade-offs, right? Because we only have so much money. We're only going to invest so much for growth and protecting the business, etc. And so we have to make trade-offs on how do we spend the money that we have. And so if cyber gets a disproportionate share of the investment, then that becomes a challenge because the shareholder then does not make money on the investment. If we spend money, all of our money in growth, they'll get great returns, but at great risk. And that's the balance, I think, that's happening in the boardroom today, and why cyber is an important topic. It's not important just because it's cyber and we're having all these breaches and we're having all these security incidents. It's important because it's now become a formidable player on the risk agenda. And as we make those trade-offs and decisions, we now have to take into account all the nuances in cyber. It's no longer just a, do you have it, yes or no? So that, I think, is a little bit of context for why now, why is this topic important? Yes, the SEC has put in some of those kind of more formal rules, but they've only done it, again, their agenda is to protect the shareholder. And they putting in these kind of formal processes to force us as board directors to protect the shareholders' interest in the boardroom.
So I love how you put that, and how you brought that to the topic of risk, because on the cyber side, we feel, many people feel that cyber has been talking about risk for a long time. But one of the realities of that is that the risk we've been talking about has been in our silo area of risk. And we think because we're cyber practitioners that our risk means the world. Our risk is the number one risk. This risk, if we don't do this, the world is going to come crumbling down. But when you put it in the context of the other aspects of risk that get talked about at the board, that typically technologists and cyber practitioners don't get access or visibility into, you don't really know how that risk plays, from fiduciary risk to operational risk and all of those things, and where that slots in. So I love how you put that. So when you think about what you're talking about, the industry has evolved over time as it relates to the communication of risk. So again, us being in this for a long time, we know when we used to communicate ones and zeros to the boards back, in the early 2000s, that was the thing that we did, right? We communicated via ones and zeros to the board. Then we transitioned and we began to speak to the board from a project-based standpoint. Hey, here's the timeline of things. You gave us some money. Here's the timeline of things that we are doing. How would you, as a board member, look to your cyber executives to communicate risk about their cyber program today that's going to resonate with the board members they need to speak to?
So I think there's a couple things, right? And I really want, for this audience, I want for us to also deep dive into what you do, and especially covering like not-for-profit boards and private company boards, because the responsibility is identical. What's different is the liability, right? I can be sued for decisions that are made in the boardroom in my personal capacity. If somebody sits on the not-for-profit board, you might have a little immunity based on, the laws in terms of the structure of that kind of entity. And in private companies, there's no really oversight. So you can do most anything you want. You can make decisions at a higher risk, etc. But I think what's important right now, where we sit, if I had to do my whole CISO career of, those years again, I think I would show up in the boardroom very differently. One thing that CISOs need to do is take the opportunity to educate the board. But again, we have to remember that, until this kind of more recent years when people like me were allowed behind the scenes into the boardroom, and people like you, Larry, were allowed inside the boardroom. Remember that for the most part, board members were made up of sitting and retired CEOs of large companies. So if you just think about that equation, there's a lot of ego in that room. And they certainly don't want little old me showing up with my zeros and ones and telling them, I'm here to educate you. And so we have to you have to almost like work within the constraints of big egos, lots of accomplishments, lots of success, and lots of brain power in that room. And so I think one of the things that, security leaders can do to help themselves in the boardroom is to show up with the intention to educate, but with the approach to share knowledge from their perspective. So people don't have to feel like, oh, this person is here to fill in a gap. Rather, this person is here with information that's helpful to do my job. So the board director, what I'm listening for is how is this practitioner, CIO, CDO, CISO, anyone in that C-suite, I am listening for how are they going to help me to do my job versus them showing up in the boardroom and telling me how they do theirs. Because frankly, as a director, I don't care how you do your job. That's what you have a management structure for. You can take your issues all the way up to the CEO. Right? So I think practitioners need to recognize that when you're in the boardroom, you have to show up with a value proposition. And your value proposition isn't telling me just about how you do your job, but how you do your job that helps me do mine. Then I'm listening intently, I'm paying attention, and I'm giving this topic the right kind of place in my queue. If I hear this is a big risk, I'm going to give it the rightful place in the discussion because I am responsible as a board director for the size and measure of certain risks, whereas others, maybe operational, maybe disruptive, but they may not rise to that level. So that's the one thing I would say practitioners, show up, share knowledge, share information, but contextualize it. So board directors are listening more carefully versus checking the box. The CISO came and talked, the CIO came and talked, and they left, and this is all good. Versus when you tell me about how I'm doing my job, I'm sitting up straight and I'm paying more attention, and I'm going to give you every ounce of my intellectual energy in that room.
Yep, I love that. And it's interesting you say that. As a CISO, having gone to the board more times than I can count over my career, I've always gone in with the intent to educate, right? And I call it indirect education. I was never telling them, it was, hey, here's something that you should know. And a lot of times I used to give them context that they could apply personally to better understand the context of what I was presenting, right? And giving those types of analogies that they could then take back and soak on, help them engage more actually with me when I was presenting and talking about certain things, right, from a risk-based standpoint. So I love that. I want to give some context to people about nonprofit boards. So I do sit on a couple of nonprofit boards, and as it relates to some of the things that Shamla talked about from a risk standpoint, a lot of it is very similar, except on a nonprofit profit board, most of the time, because let's be very honest and very clear, more people will sit on nonprofit boards versus public boards. It's just more opportunity in those spaces versus the public boards on publicly traded companies, right? So to understand the similarities and the differences, to understand that from a risk perspective, your risk profile is vastly different. And so the things that you are talking about, the biggest risk to not-for-profits is funding, is ensuring that the money that the organization gets, A, keeps flowing, and B, is being handled properly, right? And so you can, if you aren't on a board and you are interested in getting on a board, a nonprofit is a great way to understand fiduciary responsibility and get a great leg into how to govern and operate from a fiduciary responsibility standpoint. Because on public boards, that's a component, but you often on public boards get put into committees for different things, but you sit in on larger conversations. So the fiduciary one is one that, as a practitioner going to the board, I never really got visibility to. I went in there for my piece. I may sit on the audit committee, sit in with the audit committee for a while, but the overall board, I never got visibility to. So once I joined my first board, which was a not-for-profit, the fiduciary part taught me a lot. So that as I went and began having conversations about joining public boards, I had the ability to articulate my understanding of fiduciary responsibility and how I could bring some of that to the board along with my cyber and risk profile, right? So, um, so Shama, let's talk about so you're sitting on the public board. Let's talk about the board committees and the level of importance those play in the structure of a board and how those engage with the tech leaders, the CIO and the CISO, when they're coming in to sort of present the risk and things that they're dealing with.
So, let's see if we can make this really simple, right? We can all relate to the fact that typically a CEO, although they lead an organization, they don't do all the work, right? You have an organizational hierarchy, you have that kind of supports them, be responsible for the decisions they make or the decisions the organization makes, but they might have different departments, different groups with different leaders or executives leading those. So, for example, the CFO is responsible for all things finance, but ultimately the CEO is responsible for it. So the CFO is the working body of the CEO's finance agenda. Boards work exactly the same way. So the committees are the working groups of the full board. So if you think about, specialty, this is where we start to talk about specialty because the full board will listen, we vote, we make big decisions, and the voting will basically let you know whether your position is supported by the majority or not. Whereas, the working committees are intended to be exactly that, a working committee will get deeper into the detail. They will take specific topics and they will go deep dive on it. They will engage with the management team more actively and more often. They will also pick and poke and pick apart a lot of the technical and strategic decision making. So even though the committee is still it's made up of a subset of the board members, each committee will have less than the full board size, but they'll have members who are core voting members. We set the agenda, we talk about the topic, and from time to time, we will make decisions in the committee and then bring that as a recommendation to the full board. So we would say, let's go deep dive with with the technology leader on AI or on, data or data protection, whatever that may be. We'll go engage with the teams, talk in a little bit more detail. And also, of course, we get one layer deeper. We'll then come back with, we think that the risk on this topic is properly managed. Therefore, the board doesn't have to take any action. Or we might bring a recommendation back that says, we think that this is largely in hand, but there's some issues here. We need to figure out how to allocate or assign responsibility either to the CEO or someone else in the organization to take that topic forward. And so essentially what's happening is the committee is that working member. We will engage with practitioners from time to time. We'll bring back recommendations to the full board upon which they can vote on actions to take, investments to make, decisions to make, etc. So that's how the committees actually work. So typically, most all organizations, all publicly traded companies will have an audit committee. The audit committee's primary responsibility historically has been to check for the appropriate controls. And part of the controls is when a control is lacking, you're creating risk. So the audit committee charter has typically included both risk and controls. What I am seeing nowadays, and I've seen this on some of my boards, but not all of them, is that working groups can get created to cover a particular topic on a temporary basis. Not all risk topics are in the accountability of the audit committee. Sometimes organizations will have a separate risk committee and a separate audit committee, one that deals with controls, one that deals with risk. And so, smaller companies might combine them, larger companies may have them separate. But remember that because the working members are members of the full board, they all get eventually to see all of the conversations, to see all of the issues, to see all of the risks before we vote and make big decisions.
Thank you for sharing that. So a question I have, right, as it relates to the board, just members in general, how important is it for a security leader to create a relationship with members of the board? And I'll give an example. So when I was CISO of large organizations, at any organization where I had board reporting responsibilities, I always found a champion, someone in the room that I connected with on a regular basis to engage with, run things by, bounce off of, so that once I got in the room, I knew I already had a champion in the room who had seen what I'm presenting, had heard my talk track, had heard the things that I was going to be going over, so that if there became a lull where I was saying something that was questioned or that someone didn't understand, I had that person in the room who would speak up. And as a board member, right, as a member of the board with their peers, then that particular thing always everybody else in the room will start nodding. Oh, okay, right, we got it. Right, even though that person may have said the same thing I said, but because it's now coming from them, it sounds different, right? How important is that relationship that an executive creates with at least one, or maybe a few different members of the board?
So that's extremely important. Let me just make it real, right? So on some of my public company boards, I act as not just the expert on these topics, but I also coach the management team. I coach the CIO, the COO, and make sure that they understand the topics that they bring to the board, which ones are important, how to present it, what material to bring, what information to give us so that we can make good decisions, how to ask for help, etc. So, I think it's important to have a champion. Here's the challenge, and this is what I think people don't always really internalize, is you can't just look around the boardroom and say, oh, that one, Larry, I'm going to go create a relationship with Larry, right? He's going to be my champion. Because remember, and you know this,
Yeah.
politically, it's challenging, right? You can't just say, well, I'm going to go develop a relationship with this person. What I would recommend you all do, because remember that essentially the board is acting as the escalation for the CEO, right? We get to make that final decision. Is the CEO doing a good job or not a good job? So we give the CEO a report card. And so, in a typical situation, we don't just bypass our bosses and go to our boss's boss. We follow some protocol, we follow some organizational structure and policy, and also some human relationship dynamic, right? So you don't want to go try to find a board member and try to develop a relationship with them. Typically, they're not your friends, right? They again standing in the shoes of the shareholder, so they're coming to the conversation with a very different perspective. So I think having those relationships are helpful. Here's what I would suggest. When you're trying to develop those relationships, what you want to do is to give them enough information to make yourself appealing enough as a leader for them to want to reach out and say, hey, Larry, can we meet? I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee. Or can we meet before the board meeting? Or can we debrief after the board meeting? That's what you want, because typically the relationship is not going to be the other way. So you're not going to call up a board member and say, can we meet? Can we have a cup of coffee? I'd like to buy you lunch, right? But when they invite you, at that point, there's no organizational barriers. If you try to reach out to a board director, the politically correct way is to go through your corporate secretary, who's usually the general counsel, could be some other role, to go to the corporate secretary, because that's the administration hand or arm of the board. So you'll want to go through them. They will want to go to the CEO to make sure that before you go to their boss, that you're actually giving them the courtesy of the topic and the background, etc. And so follow those organizational protocols, because it's not just about, let me make a call and see if that person will be a champion for me. So, think about that as a very delicate matter. It is absolutely possible. And I will tell you that because I'm part of this community, when I'm in the boardroom, I do that more often than I think people would like. I go reach out into the organization, find the people who I can help and guide and coach and mentor, because when I do it, it's perfectly acceptable. Nobody's going to tell me I cannot. I have a legal obligation and I have the right to do it. Versus on the other side, you have an organizational structure to respect. So, very, very important. But you do need to know these people. You need to know what their hot buttons are. You need to know what's important to them so that you can show up prepared to create the conditions where that relationship will evolve into, a board member saying to you, can I buy you a cup of coffee?
Yeah, so it's funny. I was literally sitting here thinking, I'm like, yeah, you don't want to piss off your CEO. Like at the end of the day, it's not a lot of job security and pissing off your CEO. But I like that you brought up those points. You literally are a unicorn in that space of the boardroom, right? Because again, to what you brought up earlier, typically the boardroom is made up of a certain type of people. And so you don't typically have a person like yourself. And with the egos and things that come with the status that most people have achieved in order to achieve a role on a public board, they typically aren't ones who are looking at reaching down to make friends, right? And so it's important to understand just the social norms of when you are trying to generate and create that type of relationship, that you must go through the proper channels and do it in a way that doesn't piss off your CEO or other leaders, right? COO, general counsel, and the like, they may think you are trying to usurp them and step around them to do something else. So that's great. If you have any questions, I just want to put this out there. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat. Shamla and I are happy to answer any questions. So let's continue down this path. So as you, let's talk about a couple of things. So I brought up the SEC early on. So as you are looking at the landscape of things, Shamla, and you're starting to see government regulations, government regulators start to get involved in the cyber industry, what are you seeing from the boards that you sit on, the impact that that's having with the board directors and their, I'll say, I don't know if I want to say hesitancy on dealing with cyber, or maybe it's making them more compelled to deal with cyber. Like, where is it driving them?
I think there's two things. The first is, what is my responsibility as a board director? It's starting to come into focus now on the topic of cyber and the risk that cyber introduces into the environment. Because in the past, it was just another, the machine broke. Yeah, that's a risk, but we can recover from it. No problem. We'll get some engineers, they'll fix it quickly, and we'll continue our production line, right? With cyber, I think what people have seen is it's not a one time, the machine's fixed, let's move on. It's an ongoing, evolving topic that's just getting more and more serious. And so now board directors no longer want to deal with this as a one-off anomalous matter where, you come for a decision. Okay, you want to spend $100 billion. Okay, great, I sign here. What they now wanted to do is to get involved in the discussion in a deeper way, so that when they make those decisions, they know it's not a one-time decision, it's going to come back. So I think what's happening is that, directors are beginning to see that this is a risk that's ongoing. I think the second thing is that they're realizing that, one, it doesn't go away, it creates enormous opportunity. It absolutely creates enormous opportunity. The reason cyber exists is because our digital footprints are growing at such a large rate, right? And so the rate at which we're introducing innovation, the rate at which we're introducing technologies, all bringing huge value to the organizations that we are sitting on the boards for. So we don't want to stifle that, but we also want to manage the risk of that kind of accelerated growth. And so I think what they're seeing is there's opportunity in this topic. It's not just a money pit. This is about, if my technology grows and gives me the important things like speed and scale and the opportunity to build capabilities safely, that it brings huge business growth opportunities. So I think they want to get involved in it more, recognizing it's not one-off, it's going to stay, it's going to be here for a long time. They want to get involved. And I also think that board directors want to understand more. When you're making a one-off decision, it's easy to say, I look at the pros and cons on its face. It looks like I should vote here. I vote and I'm done. On the cyber topic, they want to understand more because these decisions keep coming back. These points of issue and concerns keep coming back. So I think they want to learn more because they want to understand better, recognizing that this is an ongoing topic. Simple example is finance. Everyone who sits on a board has to be financially literate. Even though you're not a CFO, you don't make decisions about money, you don't have to understand the balance sheet, but you have to be financially literate because you need to know when the company is going under and going down. So, that's a skill that's necessary. And I think this topic of technology and cyber is becoming another one of those skills. Everyone has to have some base level understanding, or else you cannot be effective.
I appreciate that. I'm going to ask another question, and we're going to start to close it down here in a couple of minutes. How much is the news cycle driving boards of directors, right, from a question standpoint? So I remember a number of years ago, two different organizations where I had board members who literally every time something was in the headlines, right, their ears were on fire, and they were bombarding me with questions related to how does this impact us? And when I got to my next board meeting, like my first 15 minutes was headline news, right? What were the latest headlines since the last board meeting, and how does that impact us? Blah blah blah. Right? Is that still a thing that you're seeing, or because of the education that the boards are starting to have and the visibility that's happening and how communication is happening to them about risk, where it's more risk-based conversations, that's lessening?
So I think, in past years, when a board director opened a newspaper or, opened a communication media site, they would see a headline about either cyber security, investigations, privacy, whatever the new security incident is. They would read about it, and it would be the first time they're seeing it, the first time they're actually encountering that issue. And then they have to scramble to educate themselves about what is this. Whereas I think what's happening nowadays is practitioners come to the boardroom prepared, they share all this information, they're making their board directors pretty knowledgeable. And so I think the news cycle is no longer driving the conversation. The news cycle might drive a few of the nuances in the questions, but I think all of us as practitioners are now driving the communication to the boards. And you need to remember that. If you don't tell them about it, they will read about it, they will hear about it, and many of us sit on multiple boards. We will hear about it in another one of our boards. And we'll wonder, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you bring this information forward proactively? So be careful that you don't bury information like that, even if you're not impacted by it, tell them you're not impacted by it, because that then says, okay, so now I'll know when I need to worry because this leader will tell me versus, the first time they're encountering it is when they open the Wall Street Journal. And so I think that the news cycle no longer dominates. I think we do. And if we continue that, I think we have a really good chance of taking it away from the uncontrolled media, cycle, and bringing that topic more in our control.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Well, I know I think we're a little over our time, but I want to go into a couple of last things, right? So, um, what is some practical advice that you would give to someone who is looking to? So, let me make sure I phrase this question properly. So, everybody wants to get on a board, right? And everybody has a lot of ideas of what board membership means, and there's this grand this mindset. If I'm on a board, oh my God, yes, right. I've even heard people when they look at my profile, go, oh my God, you're on so many boards, right? And I don't think people really understand the work associated with a board, right? They don't understand. Go through, right, you being on a couple of boards, right, just from a mindset standpoint, and help level set the amount of work that's really involved in being on a board of directors.
So here's one thing I would say. This is called board service for a reason. That word board service is not just a word, it has meaning. It truly is service. Being on a board is not a career progression. It's not like you say, first I'm a financial analyst, then I'm the, financial manager, then I'm the CAO, then I'm the CFO, right? So it's not a progression in your career. Being on a board is service as a result of a long, storied, successful, accomplished career. It's by successful, you don't have to have made tons of money. By successful, I mean you've had a lot of experiences that you can bring into the boardroom that gives perspective on the topics the board will be wrestling with. So it's called board service because, some people just think that it's progression. So therefore, you're going to get your current compensation plus. Do some research, make sure you understand one, the obligations and responsibilities of a board director, understand the compensation and the comp structure. Some boards, you will, for the first few years, you'll have to pay them to be on their board, right? When I say pay them, I mean pay to be, not pay them necessarily, pay the tax man to be on the board. So remember that you need to understand the financials that go with this. You need to understand what drives you, what is motivating you to want to be on a board. Do you have a lot of liability? You're not a whole lot of comp. And is that something that you really want to do? Now, it's great to be able to sit with the CEO and go, CEO of a Fortune 100 company. Let me give you a report card. You didn't do so great. Right? There's something really interesting and appealing about that, but it's the small part of the job. The bigger part of the job is the liability for standing in the hole and representing the shareholders. Everyone who's anyone gets to sue a board because whether it's an employee, whether it's a internal structure, external structure, shareholders, investors, regulators, everyone can add the board as a potential party in a lawsuit. And so the responsibility is pretty high. So be aware of all those things before you start spending the time and energy looking to sit on a board. Once you sit on the board, you'll see that it is a lot of work. But the reality is that the work effort is unlike a full-time job. Like 4 times a year, maybe some of them are a little bit more. You meet, you talk, you make big decisions, you leave, and so that's great. But when the company is in a crisis, you're meeting every day, sometimes every hour, you're meeting through the night, through the day. And that to do that, you have to be one, available, and it's frowned upon if you're not there to support and guide an organization in crisis. So, think about all those aspects before you just decide that board service is in your future. It's service for a reason.
Yeah. And I'll add, so a lot of people think that, oh, it's just meeting once a quarter. Listen, there's a thing called board prep, and there's packets that you get, right, a week or two before the board meeting that you have to go through and form all the questions that you possibly have about every single component because you get one opportunity. And when you get in there, if you don't get your question off, the vote happens, it's too late. It's done. So you have to go in extremely prepared with everything you think you want to ask and be able to have intelligent conversations around every topic that's presented in front of you as a board director. It's
And
extremely
Larry,
important.
just to add, yeah, just to add to what you just said, because I think it bears repeating, when something is handed to you as a director, whether you read it or not, whether you paid attention, whether you understood it or not, is not material when it comes to you being held accountable for what's in the material. So when I get 500 pages of a document to read, there is an inherent assumption that I have read it, I understand it, and when I vote on it, I'm voting using all the information there. So I'm held accountable for knowing and understanding it. You don't get away from that. If it's on the record, you are assumed to have it, understood it, and read it. And that creates its own, like you just talked about, workload. Because you
Right.
can no longer just peruse it, you can't just flip through it. The assumption that you read it, understand it, are making decisions using it is an important one, and it may show up in a future litigation.
Yep. And that's the piece right there that so many people are not aware of. That component tied to liability can be the thing that can get a lot of people in hot water. And we've seen it over time where people claim they weren't aware and class action lawsuits. Oh, board members saying, well, we weren't aware that this, but it was all there in black and white. Right. So Shamla, I want to end with this. I want to end. So with your experience, with what you knew as a practitioner, now know as a sitting board member, what are 3 things that you would share with every practitioner who is assessing, right, board service as something that they want to add to their career path? What are the 3 things that you would share that you think will be most valuable to have them carry away from this session today?
So I'd say the first is, if you are looking for a board role, you need to make sure that everyone you know knows that. Don't assume that anyone knows that you are on the path for looking for board service. Okay, so tell everyone. But when you tell them, the second thing is you need to make sure that you have what it's going to take, right? I tell people this just as an aside. I tell people, if you have never had a conversation with their big CEO, then how on earth are you going to, in good conscience, go out and say, I'm going to be on this board because I want to give that CEO a report card on their performance? So make sure that you have and you're building the skills, and the tools that you need to be able to do those kinds of things. Because you're going to face off with some pretty accomplished people, and you have to be able to hold your ground. So make sure you understand what it is, prepare for it, build the skills that you need, and build the relationships that you need to support you. So one, tell people so that they know you're looking, because I'll tell you that, 25% of the board jobs out there go to people who come through recruiting firms. The other 75% go to people who are referred by their network. So make sure people know you're looking, make sure you have it, and the network is strong, and the network is going to be people who will advocate for you. And then the last thing is make sure you bring the tools and the skills that are needed. And it takes a long time, so build the skills. It took me 3 years before I got my first conversation about a board role. Like, I cut my teeth in not-for-profits for sure, but my first publicly traded company board role came to me after 3 years of looking and preparing and getting all the right education and information, etc. So, all of those things I think will hold you in good stead as you go through a board search journey.
Thank you for that, Shamla. I appreciate your time today. I think this has been a wildly helpful conversation for many. Again, everyone, we want to thank you for joining. We hope that today you learned something from this discussion that you can take away, whether you wanted a board seat, whether you were looking at a board seat, or whether you're just looking to figure out how to better communicate with your own board. I think there were a ton of nuggets in here that Shamla shared that you can take back and be better tomorrow than you were today when you got here. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you on the other side.
Thanks, Larry.